Hello and welcome to our study for today. We are in a series entitled Lesser Known Bible Heroines. And today's heroine or lady figure or female figure from the Bible is a lady named Abigail. Let's pick up the story of Abigail in 1 Samuel chapter 25. And let's start reading from verse number 1. 1 Samuel 25 verse number 1. And Samuel died, and all the Israelites were gathered together and lamented him and buried him in his house at Ramah. And David arose and went down to the wilderness of Paran. And there was a man in Maon whose possessions were in Carmel. And the man was very great. He had 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats, and he was shearing his sheep in Carmel. And the name of the man was Nabal. Now here's the story. David was anointed to be king of Israel, but he wasn't king at that stage or at this stage in proceedings. He was actually an outlaw. He was pursued by King Saul, and he lived in the great outdoors. He lived as an outlaw, and certain wanted men that were in debt, various fighters, warriors, attached themselves to David. And by this stage in history, David had about 600 men that were with him. He had a small army of valiant men. Now he came to this fella Nabal. Nabal lived around Mount Carmel, and he was a farmer. He was a very wealthy man. David sent 10 of his young men to guard Nabal's flock. Now it was shearing season, and evidently the enemies of Israel would come through and they would steal sheep or hurt people there. And so David's men became a bodyguard to Nabal. And he protected Nabal and his shearers, sort of like a security guard at a shopping centre. Some people are there to protect. So after this happened, David simply asked Nabal for some form of payment. He didn't say what that was. He said, whatever is acceptable to you, whether it's food or animals or maybe money, whatever you have, could you please give some payment to my men? Now, Nabal was very wealthy and he had plenty to spare, but basically Nabal said to David, get lost. Get lost. And David was angry. And then David decided that he wanted to take some vengeance on this man Nabal. Now let's learn a little bit about Nabal. The word Nabal means fool. He was a fool, but he was other things. The Bible tells us that he was a very great man. We read that in verse number 2. He was a very great man. He was obviously well known in the area. He was influential. And then he was rich. Even today, if you have 3,000 sheep, you're doing pretty well for yourself, I would imagine. And he had 1,000 goats. He was very rich. And then the Bible says in verse number 3 that he was churlish. Now this word churlish means mean-spirited, rude, or impolite. He wasn't a very nice man. No one likes a churlish man. But Nabal was a man. He was an influential man. He was very wealthy, but he wasn't a very nice man. In fact, the Bible says in verse 3, not only was he churlish or impolite or rude, but he was evil. He was one bad man. And he treated David's men with contempt, and he even returned evil for good. The Bible also says that he was disloyal. He was loyal only to himself. He was selfish, verse 11. He only cared for himself. He was proud. He did not hear rebuke or reproof. And then eventually, I'm getting to the end of the story here, but Nabal was dead. God killed him. After 10 days, he died. Well, things weren't looking very good for Nabal because David was a fierce warrior, and he had 600 warriors with him. And he was going to go and take this out on Nabal and most probably his men. And David was bent on destruction. Now, whether this was right or not, it most probably wasn't the right thing to do. But David didn't always do the right thing, even though he was a man after the heart of God. But enter Abigail. Enter this lady Abigail. Now there's some things we learn about this lady Abigail. In verse number 3 we read this: the name of his wife, Nabal's wife, was Abigail. First of all, she was of good understanding. The Bible says she was a woman of good understanding and of a beautiful countenance. She was a beautiful woman. Everyone knew that this lady was beautiful to look upon. Now it's interesting that the Bible records this, that she was beautiful to look upon. She was beautiful and yet she was godly. She was a godly woman. She was kind. In verse number 18, she brought a gift to David and his men, and it was a big gift. It was a very generous gift. You can read about it. 200 loaves of bread and 5 sheep and corn and raisins and so on. And she put them all on donkeys and took them to David. She was practical. She tried to put some water on she tried to put water on the fire of David's anger. David was angry. David wanted retribution against Nabal. And yet Abigail was very, very kind. She was practical. She was brave. Look what she did here. She went down and she was very, very brave. She ran towards the man who was going to kill her husband and most probably all of his men. She put her life on the line. And then she was humble. Look at verse 23. When Abigail saw David, she hasted and lighted off the ass, the donkey, and fell before David on her face and bowed herself to the ground and fell at his feet. She was humble. And look what she said: upon me, my Lord, upon me let this iniquity be, and let thine handmaid, I pray thee, speak in thine audience, and hear the words of thine handmaid. She was humble. In fact, she offered to take the sin of Nabal upon herself. She said, let the sin be on me. Let me take the punishment that Nabal deserves. Let the iniquity be on me. And then not only that, she was prophetic. Look down in verse 29. She said, yet a man is risen to pursue thee, to seek thy soul, talking about Saul, because the King Saul was chasing David. King Saul was hunting David. King Saul, even though David was only ever loyal to Saul, Saul wanted David dead. Look at verse 29 again. But the soul of my Lord shall be bound in the bundle of life with the Lord thy God. She was prophetic. She prophesied that God would keep David safe from King Saul. And of course, that is what happened. And so here's Abigail. She's a woman, she's a beautiful woman. She was wise, she had understanding, she was kind, she was practical, she was generous, she was brave, she was humble, and then she was rewarded. We mentioned before that Nabal died. Nabal did die because God killed him. He was an evil man. Nabal died, and then Abigail became David's wife. She became the wife of him who was to become the king of Israel, that being David. And what a great reward that was. We don't know much else about Abigail, but we do know that she was a great woman in the Bible. Now, what's the application here? Well, I suppose there's numbers of applications. Young ladies, if the fellas won't do right, you do right. You do right. Walk close to God, be a godly lady, and ask God for understanding when you face these big decisions in life. And we all will face big decisions in life. Abigail had a massive decision to make to try and save the life of Nabal and his family. Abigail knew exactly what to do, and she did it. She was a woman of understanding. You say, how do you get understanding? How can you understand, or how do you get to know what to do in those times of crisis in your life? Well, here's Proverbs 9 and verse 10. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the holy is understanding. You know, we need understanding, and we get understanding by knowing God. We fear God and we know God. That's the beginning of wisdom. Fearing God, knowing God. So do you fear God? Do we fear God? Do we know God as we ought to? That's how we get understanding. You say, how do you stop from making wrong decisions? You have understanding, you have wisdom, and you get that by having the fear of God and the knowledge of the Holy, or the Holy One, which is God. Abigail obviously was a godly woman. Along with all her other attributes, she was a godly woman, and she was a woman of understanding. And she made practical decisions based on that understanding, and God blessed her. Very interesting character in the Bible was Abigail. Well, we've seen a few of these lesser-known characters over the last couple of weeks, and there's plenty more to come. And so, until next time, see you then.